certainly it's very clear that we haven't really fully followed the blueprint that Robert Schuman was laying down, because he said Europe cannot and must not remain an economic and technical enterprise. It needs a soul. And Jacques Delors defined that soul as spirituality and meaning. That's why it's instructive for us to revisit Schumann's writings and speeches to remind ourselves of the vision that motivated him as the French foreign minister to propose such a radically alternative solution to the post-war problem of Germany, one based on Jesus' command to love God and neighbor. This is a solution based on forgiveness, reconciliation, and brotherly love, so opposite in spirit to the Treaty of Versailles. So here was a vision of Europe as a community of peoples, as I said, sharing a common spiritual and cultural heritage deeply rooted in Christian values. Robert Schuman only wrote one book, a very short book called For Europe, For Europe. He collected many books. He had a library of about 8,000 books, some of which still being maintained at his home in Seychelles near Metz in France. But it's quite remarkable that he only really wrote one small book, but he of course made many speeches. I'm going to draw out some key statements from what he said here. We are called to bethink ourselves of the Christian basics of Europe by forming a democratic model of governance which through reconciliation develops into a community of peoples in freedom, equality, solidarity and peace, and which is deeply rooted in Christian basic values. Now I mentioned that Schuman talked about a soul and said this: the emerging identity of a new Europe cannot and must not remain an economic and technical enterprise. It needs a soul. And he defined the soul as the conscience of its historical affinities and of its responsibilities in the present and in the future, and a political will at the service of the same human ideal. Now, you may need to think about what he's saying. For him, the soul of Europe was that which had animated the spiritual and cultural community of those peoples populating the western peninsula of the Eurasian landmass, which we strangely call the continent, or even the continent. It's really just a peninsula, isn't it? But as we described last night, it was the coming of the story of Jesus, the spreading of the message of this book, from Greece, from Rome, etc., right through this peninsula that we call Europe today, that gave a common foundation for the culture that has emerged. All across this continent, we have the symbol of the cross. All across this continent, we have understandings about time involving past, present, and future that only came from the Bible. That concept of time does not exist outside of the Bible. Our understanding of human beings comes out of the Bible. When the American founding fathers said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. I have some Indian friends who say, wait a minute, who says it's self-evident? Nobody in India finds that self-evident. Why do you call that self-evident? The reason being, the American founding fathers were the product of a culture influenced for centuries by this book. And so we need to recognize, remind ourselves again of the true roots and foundations of Europe, and that was in recognition that it was the coming of this message that so shaped the culture, so gave the deepest values, even if it took old classical values and virtues and infused them with fresh understanding, fresh foundations. This was the soul of Europe. The soul of something is that which animates it, like putting your hand in a children's glove, children's puppet, and animating, giving life to that puppet. It was the soul of the gospel message that animated European culture and gave fresh meaning to the word, in Him we live and move and have our being. And so it was the story of Jesus and the book telling that story that have been the greatest influencing factors shaping Europe's identity and values. And Schumann's strong conviction was that Europe's only future lay in rebuilding Europe on these same foundations. Now, there were contemporaries that were very influential on Robert Schuman, Christopher Dawson and Jacques Maritain, the two of them, who helped shape his thinking. And I want to quote here from Christopher Dawson, who's also influenced me a lot. Europe owes its unique character to the fact that it is and has always been a society of nations, each intensely conscious of its own social personality and its own political institutions and laws, but all united by a common spiritual tradition, a common intellectual culture, and common moral values. It's only by the recovery of these common traditions and values and in the strengthening of them that Europe can be saved. Now, he was, of course, writing this nearly 2 generations ago. But this was also the view of others, such as Konrad Adenauer, Alcide de Gasperi. Adenauer became the Chancellor, of course, of Western Germany. Alcide de Gasperi, the Prime Minister of Italy. And after signing the European Coal and Steel Community Treaty in Paris in April 1951, Adenauer wrote to Schuman and said, "I regard it as a particularly favorable and even providential sign that all the weight of the task to be undertaken rests on the shoulders of men who, like you, our mutual friend, President de Gasperi, and myself, are filled with the desire to build a new edifice of Europe on Christian foundations. I believe that few occasions in the history of Europe have offered better opportunities for achieving such a goal." En route to signing this treaty, these 3 men had joined in a prayer retreat at the historic Maria Laach monastery near Koblenz, which was a place of personal, spiritual, and intellectual refreshment both for Adenauer and Schuman, and had been actually a refuge for Adenauer when Hitler, before the war, when Adenauer had been the mayor of Cologne, was about out to assassinate him. And so he took refuge in this monastery. For in Schumann's understanding, the roots of true democracy, the principle of equality, the practice of brotherly love, individual freedom, respect for the rights of the individual, all came from Christ's teachings. Democracy owed its existence to Christianity. He argued practical application of these teachings had transformed Europe through the centuries, resulting in liberal democracy. This is perhaps not a standard textbook version, but I'm wanting to give you some original sources here to convince you that this is the truth. Again, Robert Schuman said Christian principles have become features of our civilization, and this is what he's writing in For Europe, to which the 17th century rationalists owed their human and citizens' rights, which are essentially Christian. Loving your neighbor as yourself was a democratic principle which applied to nations meant being prepared to serve and love neighboring peoples. Now, let's just pause on that. These are very familiar words, love your neighbor as yourself. This was the command of Jesus, of course. And very often we ask, yes, who is our neighbor, just as Jesus was asked. But let's pause about this. If this is the command of Jesus to love your neighbor as yourself, we've got to ask ourselves, all right, to what level are we prepared to exercise this command? Now, in Holland, Belgian jokes are quite popular. And in England, Irish jokes. And I'm sure the Greeks tell Macedonian jokes and so on. You can name them all. And, of course, the safest thing is to dress them up as Hittite jokes or something. Robert Schuman was simple, naive enough to think that we should apply the teachings of Jesus even in the arena of international politics. This is what made his approach totally out of the box. He wasn't thinking in terms of Machtpolitik, power politics. He was wanting to obey the command of Jesus. And when he was underground in France, after he had escaped from solitary confinement in Germany, and he had come to the conclusion that there was was no way Germany could sustain the war. He spent his time thinking, what kind of Europe would please God? What kind of Europe do we need to move towards? How can we get away from this constant cycle syndrome of nations fighting nations, especially France and Germany, constantly at it like alley cats through the centuries and dragging other nations into their complex. And so he took these words of Jesus very literally. He says, this is what we must do. We talked last night about these tragic spiritual fault lines across Europe that still continue to influence the headlines. And we said that the EU, NATO, the UN are powerless to heal those rifts. That is something for the body of Christ. And so we must take this command of Jesus seriously. What does it mean to love our neighbor from other nations, other denominations, etc.? Democracy, Schuman believed, was essentially evangelical. That didn't mean he was a member of the Evangelical Alliance or anything. The word evangelical there, he meant in terms of it has its roots in the gospel of the good news of Jesus, a good news of love, since love was its mainspring. Democracy will either be Christian or it will not be. An anti-Christian democracy will be a parody which will sink into tyranny or into anarchy. Before we move away from this idea of loving your neighbor, we're going to be looking at the issue of migration as well. How can Europe fulfill this command to love our neighbors who are knocking on our doors? Importunately, if you like. We talked last night about Deuteronomy 10, verse 19, which it says, love the alien. How can we do that in a realistic world? For Schuman, crude democracy of the Hellenic age was based on majority voting, and it would end in a tyranny of the majority. True democracy, he said, required servanthood, serving the people and acting in agreement with the people. And the goals had to start with peace, and the means had to be works of peace. And so for Schuman, a united future Europe had to be both based on Christian and democratic principles. The European story was deeply rooted in the Christian story. Cut off from those roots, Europe would lose the foundation for equality, human dignity, tolerance, and compassion. The Democrat could... Oh, all right. I'll skip over here and talk about the European spirit. So the soul was that which had actually given birth to the European civilization. What was the spirit then? What did he mean by the spirit? He used this word spirit to refer to the recognition of this basic historic reality and the corresponding attitude that would be a proper response, an appropriate response from us, an attitude, a perspective, an outlook that Europeans ought to have towards Europe as a whole and towards the nations as part of that whole. The European spirit, he says, signifies being conscious of belonging to a cultural family and to have a willingness to serve that community in the spirit of total mutuality, without any hidden motives of hegemony for the selfish exploitation of others. Such a spirit, he said, is needed, which means that we need to be aware of our specifically European common patrimony, and we need to have the will to safeguard it and develop it. Well, talking of such Christian roots today sounds anachronistic, politically incorrect, even intolerant and arrogant and dangerous. It signifies for many a head in the sand denial that time has marched on, history has marched on to a new era, that there's no going back to tired old Christendom. And in a relativistic postmodern age, it's politically incorrect to claim priority for any one worldview over another. All are equally valid, we're often told. Nothing is absolutely true. No belief can claim that it's true. Of course, that's a totally absurd statement in itself. And most beliefs hold that they are uniquely true. Islam, Christianity, and the belief of those who hold absolutely that no belief is true, we all hold to our beliefs. The claim that Europe's roots are primarily Christian is ignored today in the light of the presence of many later competitors, and hence the rejection of the mention of God, Judeo-Christian tradition, and the proposed European Constitution. But what really is the source of Europe's basic values? Is that just a matter of conjecture, of historical facts? We don't invent roots, we discover them. Pope John Paul II said, multiple are the cultural roots that have contributed to reinforce Europe's values, from the spirit of Greece to that of Roman law and virtue, from the contributions of the Latin, Celtic, Germanic, Slav, Finno-Ugric peoples, to those of the Jewish culture and the Islamic world. These different factors found in the Judeo-Christian tradition the power that harmonized, consolidated, and promoted them. Of course, we expect folks to say such things, but as I said last night, even arch-atheists like Richard Dawkins candidly admit we cannot understand European history without understanding Christianity and the Bible. Jürgen Habermas, widely regarded one of the world's most influential secular philosophers, says this, that egalitarian universalism, from which sprang the ideals of freedom and a collective life and solidarity, the autonomous conduct of life and emancipation, the individual morality of conscience, human rights and democracy, is the direct legacy of the Judeo ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. This legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the object of a continual critical reappropriation and reinterpretation. Up until this day, there is no alternative to it. And in the light of the current challenges of post-national constellation, we must draw sustenance now, as in the past, from this substance. Everything else is idle, postmodern chatter. I'm reminded of the proverbial story of the drunk looking for his keys under a lamppost at night. When asked where he lost them, he says, over there in the dark, but there's more light here. Is this a picture, not a picture of modern Europeans who stubbornly refuse to look for the lost keys to Europe's future outside the orb of Europe's Enlightenment thought? The question remains, which world and life view can give us a sustainable future, answers for the pressing questions of our day? We need to ask ourselves if the multiple crises facing us in Europe today, the economic, political, social, religious, environmental, are not the result of ignoring Schuman's warnings that the European movement will only be successful if future generations manage to tear themselves away from the temptation of materialism, which corrupted society by cutting it off from its spiritual roots. And so, recalling this vision for Europe, Schumann's understanding of the soul and the spirit of Europe can be the first steps in the recovery of direction and movement towards becoming a community of peoples deeply rooted in basic Christian values.